Welcome to Volunteering Victoria's webinar on volunteer engagement surveys with Mark Joyner and Christine Stankowski. Before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians where I am broadcasting from today, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd encourage anyone who's dialing in from other parts of the country to acknowledge the traditional custodians where they are via the chat box. So just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our two guests. In the interests of other listeners, please keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar. There's a public chat box where you can send messages or submit questions for our two wonderful presenters. And at the end of the webinar, if you're having any technical troubles, please also use that public chat function to let us know, and we'll assist. And then after today, the webinar will be available to stream via Volunteering Victoria's website. So without further ado, let me introduce today's guests. So Christine Stankowski is the Volunteer Engagement Manager at Lord Smith, Australia's largest and busiest not-for-profit animal hospital. Approximately 400 volunteers support Lord Smith to improve the health and happiness of animals and people who care for them. In 2016, Christine launched Flutterby, a consultancy designed to empower organisations to reach their goals through effective volunteering. Through her consulting, Christine has assisted government and not-for-profit organisations by leading research projects, volunteer program reviews, and numerous strategic projects for the broader volunteering sector. Christine has a strong interest and qualifications in continuous improvement, community and stakeholder engagement, and change management. She is heavily invested in growing volunteer management capability and raising the profile of leaders of volunteers. Welcome, Christine. We also have with us today Mark Joyner, who is the Volunteer Program Manager for Zoos Victoria, a program which has over 850 volunteers at 3 sites across Victoria. Mark has previously worked as a contracted advisor to the Department of Veterans Affairs, establishing a network of programs specifically targeted at decreasing the incidence of social isolation amongst the older veteran and general population. This has resulted in a network of over 45 clubs across Victoria, all of which were run by volunteers with assistance from DVA. Her background is in health, and after having worked in the aged care sector for many years, she developed a cognitive activity program resource to provide mentally stimulating activities to people in residential care. She has been on the board of the Australasian Managers of Volunteers since 2012. And welcome, Mark. Thank you both for being here with me.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Wonderful. So I'd like to first start with our two questions that we often go to, which is tell us a little bit about yourself and your role. So Christine, we'll go to you first.
Sure. So I'm the Volunteer Engagement Manager at Lord Smith Animal Hospital, and my role really is around developing and implementing strategies to strengthen the engagement of volunteers at Lord Smith. So for example, we have a volunteer advisory committee, which I support. I'm also doing a lot of continuous improvement activities, implementing change management processes for changes which impact the volunteers. So for example, we've got a second site opening in a month or so. And my role is also around advocating for the volunteers through my role on the extended leadership team. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what my role is, yeah.
Fantastic, Christine. How about you, Marg?
Yes, and my role is Volunteer Program Manager, and very much sort of closely aligned with what Christine was saying. It's a strategic role, I guess, more than that operational. I sometimes think when people hear, volunteer management, it immediately sort of defaults back to things like rostering and so forth. But again, my role is strategic direction and also compliance, which I know for a lot of you will have been a big thing now with COVID. So really looking at how we grow and build our volunteer program across the sites at Zoos Victoria.
Fantastic, Marg. So I do ask this question of everyone, and because we've had Marg a couple of times, she may keep her answer brief, but I really think it's always very interesting to learn how individuals got into volunteer engagement, because it's not something that you study at university, and it's not always the most obvious career path. So Christine, we might go to you. How did you get involved in the volunteering sector?
Sure. So I volunteered a lot when I was a teenager at a horse riding centre, and I always found it immensely rewarding. But what really got me into the sector was when I volunteered for a month in Thailand, teaching English to disadvantaged children. And that kind of experience made me realise that I wanted to change careers. Before that, I was a graphic designer. And I really wanted to do something that was focused on helping communities. So when I got back to Australia, I started volunteering at Starlight Children's Foundation in South Australia, and I just happened to ask the right question at the right time and ended up with a job as a partnerships and volunteer coordinator, and that was back in 2006, and that's kind of went from there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so often it's an accidental conversation or, temporary role that leads people into a whole new career direction. Marg, did you want to talk to people about how you got involved?
Yeah, well, look, a little bit of it is in that bio. I came to it from nursing, really, and there were certain programs that I was involved with during my time in aged care and in psychiatric facilities that were volunteer involving. And when I left that side of things and went into community programs, we were, heavily reliant on volunteers running those, and eventually, as you mentioned, with the Department of Veterans Affairs and our Day Clubs program, and then onto the zoo. So a little bit of a circuitous route too.
Fantastic. And so now to get into the nuts and bolts of what we're all here to discuss and think about, which is volunteer engagement and specifically volunteer engagement surveys. But when we were discussing this, I guess we wanted to start with, hearing from both of our presenters about how they would describe volunteer engagement and what specifically it tends to look like at their organisation. So Marg, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, it's look, for me, it's a bit of a package, and the first step in that is encouraging engagement from people in the community that are aligned with our mission and vision. So with Zoos Victoria, it's about fighting extinction and securing a future rich in wildlife. So we want people that I guess that speaks to their values, and they want to be involved, and they want to be able to contribute in that way. And so then looking at what the engagement looks like is, as I said, it's a package. So we tend to look at volunteer engagement in such terms as the number of volunteers we have or the number of hours that they contribute. And I really think that both of those are good measures of engagement, but they're not the total picture. So then looking at how your volunteers feel about your organisation, how they engage in a whole range of ways. So even online we can track, but also looking at how rewarding they find their roles, how happy they feel about the organisation, how confident they feel about your organisation. And we'll get on to how we measure some of those things when we talk about the tools, I suppose, specifically. But also in being able to measure their contribution and feed that back, I think is a really important measure of engagement as well. Fantastic,
Marg. Did you want to talk about volunteer engagement at Lort Smith, Christine?
Sure. So I guess similar to Marg, if I'm thinking of volunteer engagement, to me that's around enabling people to give their time and skills to participate in the community to achieve positive outcomes. And at Lort Smith, the volunteers extend our reach to achieve our mission. So, you know, with our adoption centre volunteers and our foster carers, it's through them and their support that we're able to help and rehome more animals. We have concierge volunteers, and with their support, we're able to improve the experience of clients and visitors and reduce the waiting times at Lort Smith. We also have our pet therapy volunteers who promote the benefits of the human-animal bond by providing pet therapy with their assessed dogs in the community at our partner facilities. And we have a fantastic team of administration volunteers who support a whole range of areas across the organisation. For example, we've got an amazing volunteer, Georgina, who writes sympathy cards for all our bereaved clients. So yeah, it's I guess our volunteers at Lort Smith that help us achieve more than what we would without their support.
Fantastic. And so thinking about it, and Marg, you touched a little bit on it, but how do we actually measure how our volunteers feel about us, and what sort of tools do we have at our disposal? And I'll go to you, Christine. What do you guys have set up at Lort Smith?
Sure. And I guess with your question around why we measure volunteer engagement, it's around tracking volunteer satisfaction, identifying areas that are working well, areas for improvement, and to consult with and involve volunteers in decisions and matters which impact them. There's obviously a very strong connection between engagement and retention of volunteers. Yeah, so at Lort Smith, what we do volunteer surveys annually. We do a lot of focus groups, workshops. It's more of on an as needs basis. So, for example, we've recently done some online workshops talking about our brand refresh, which we've just done. We've done some for our second site, letting volunteers, giving them all the information about changes that are happening, opportunities to ask questions. And we've also done that for volunteer strategy as well. So getting groups of volunteers in to get their input on actions for our volunteer strategy. We have a volunteer advisory committee as well. So we started in 2016. We meet monthly, but they have a lot of ongoing activities that happen all the time. So, for example, they hosted a trivia night for all the volunteers a couple of weeks ago. And also, I think it's around looking to measure volunteer engagement, looking at things like we track the percentage of roster gaps filled, and that goes in a monthly report that goes to our board. So that helps, identify where we need to recruit, but also how engaged the volunteers are and if there's any areas of issue. And we measure the outcomes as well. So things like the number of animals that were fostered, the number of animals that were adopted each month, number of animal interactions through our pet therapy program. We do also measure how many hours were contributed each month. And I know that's a bit of a controversial topic because some people don't believe that that's important, but for us, it's around that does show a level of engagement, and it's something that volunteers, it means something to them that they've contributed however many hours. We also, at the end of each of their shifts, when they clock on and clock off, they then are prompted with questions, which is another avenue for us to get our information from them, feedback. So, for example, what was the highlight of your shift today? And then we're able to, find that information, and we share that in our volunteer newsletters as well. We also do an exit survey as well with our volunteers who are resigning to really look at why volunteers are leaving the organisation and if there's any areas of improvement that we can work on.
Fantastic. And yeah, the slide only lists a couple of components, but there are so many facets, which is why we ended up narrowing the scope of this webinar to focus on surveys. But Margot, I'll go to you. What tools do you guys have, broadly speaking, at the zoo to look at measuring volunteer engagement?
Yeah, well, just to sort of go where Christine went at first is the why do we do it? And I think that's really important when you are looking at volunteer engagement, is the why. And it gets back to that continuous improvement cycle, and what do we want to start, what do we want to keep, and what do we want to stop. Certainly your tools that you use for volunteer engagement can help you answer those questions. But what do we use? Primarily, one of the things we use is our annual volunteer satisfaction survey. Now, this used to be a biannual survey. We used to send it out in April and in November each year. But we're part of, we're a statutory body of state government. And so as staff, we respond to a thing called the People Matter survey, which some of the Volunteering Victoria members might be familiar with, but it's a state government survey for state government staff. And so to be able to better align our workforce, both paid and unpaid, at the zoo, we've decided now to do the volunteer satisfaction survey once a year, and it coincides with the time that the People Matter survey goes to paid staff, so that we're on some issues getting a very good side-by-side picture of what's happening. That survey has one question within it that's within 10 parts. So it's about a 30 question survey. It takes less than 10 minutes. And if anybody's looking at surveys, and I'm happy to speak to anybody outside of this forum, but I would strongly recommend that it's less than 10 minutes. But one question is divided into 10 parts, which is your agreement with statements such as, you know, I am proud to volunteer for Zoos Victoria. I feel valued. I would recommend this volunteering experience to others. I feel it's time well spent, you know, satisfied, happy. I'm integrated into the organisation. I'm clear about my role. So there are about 10 questions there. And those ones probably really form the backbone of answering how volunteers are engaged with our organisation and how they feel about it. Outside of that, there are probably other measures that are worth thinking about. And Christina touched on a couple, like, you know, your retention rate, your hours. I know and agree with the sentiment that, you know, hours are becoming a bit of a difficult area sometimes to talk about in volunteer leadership, but I prefer to see them as part of the package. And they are a valuable measure, because obviously, in the same way as staff engagement, if people are not showing up, there's often, that's a sign of something wrong. So your hours, your retention, again, Christine touched on the exit survey, and I really think that they are a very powerful tool, exit surveys, as part of that, you know, life cycle of volunteerism. The other thing is I also keep Excel spreadsheets of just general feedback. So emails that I may receive about, look, to give you an example, with the recent earthquake that we had, I sent a general email to our volunteers, just reaching out to them to see if they were okay, but also reassuring them that our sites and our animals were okay, which is incredibly important to them. And a number of them bounced back emails saying, oh, it's so lovely that you've reached out, or I really appreciate it. I'll actually flick those into a spreadsheet where they're just broadly categorized, and it also tells us a bit about how we're tracking. So there are other things to think about in ways you can measure your engagement.
absolutely. And capturing that picture is so important, because otherwise these things get buried, but really do paint a picture of how engaged your workforce is. So now to the nuts and bolts. And as I said, we have decided to focus on survey construction just as a bit of a baseline. And so I guess, you know, I'll go to you both and ask how you generally construct your volunteer engagement surveys, and think about who do you know, who does it go out to? How often does it go out? And, you know, I guess, how do you frame the question so you're able to use the data? And Margot, go back to you first.
Look, I guess one of the most helpful things I ever did was engage with an evaluation expert from a university. And again, I'm happy to talk to people about that offline, but there are a number of universities that offer courses in evaluation. And oftentimes people are very, very happy to look for a keystone project, and our volunteer program was one of those, but they're often just very happy to talk to you anyway. And so from that aspect, I would say always involve somebody for whom, you know, evaluation and data and all those things are their bag, because we can often sit like we do in volunteer management, because I know people out there all know it's a role of many hats, and go, well, now I'm expected to do this. I think it's great to have an idea of what you want to know, but certainly talk to people who are experts in the field to help you determine what needs to go in that survey. A lot of programs I know might be thinking, well, I'm sure that cost, you know, $1 million. It cost me a painting that was done by one of the elephants, because this person needed to do it as part of their university studies, and they just thought it was a great opportunity. So I would really urge you, if you're thinking about these things, to reach out to universities. And they really helped us in terms of the type of questions to ask, even if you're going to also use this to perhaps gather some demographic data, where you need to place that, and that, you know, for us was at the end rather than at the start. The other thing I would probably say is not too many open-ended questions. It's great to have some section in there that people can give feedback to, but generally speaking, we haven't found that a lot of open-ended questions give us the sort of data and reliable data that we're seeking. And yeah, I would certainly talk to other departments within your organisation to see if there's information that they seek. But in terms of putting it together, someone who's actually qualified in evaluation has been really key for us.
Fantastic. And Christine, how did you go about framing your survey at Lord-Smith?
So I guess one of the key things is to think about the audience and to write for them. And so writing in a really clear, concise format that's easy to read, keeping questions short, not waffling on. You know, I guess a good thing that I try and think of is, can I ask the same question in less words? You know, consider, does your organisation engage volunteers who have English as a second language, or who are from, you know, have different levels of education? So keeping it to really common language which everyone understands, that's really simple, avoiding jargon, buzzwords, acronyms, and keeping paragraphs, in the introduction, keeping the paragraphs brief, really to the point, having spaces in between, just make it as easy as possible for people to read and understand. The survey is really helpful. And the other thing, Mark touched on this as well, is providing opportunities for people to provide ratings. So whether it's to what extent do you agree with these statements, agree, firmly disagree, etc. So that way you want to make it as easy as easy as possible to analyse the data. And as Mark touched on, if you have too many open-ended questions, it just makes it really difficult to be able to analyse the data later on. So still provide an opportunity somewhere in there for them to provide any additional comments, but I think keeping that multiple choice questions or opportunities to really be succinct in their responses makes it easier to analyse the data later.
Absolutely. And I think that's certainly, you know, share a personal reflection as, you know, an instinct. You think, gosh, I want to give my volunteers the opportunity to type out how they're feeling. But in terms of actually using the data, it can often be most helpful if they're closed questions. So I'll throw back to you, Christine. I guess, what are the other considerations that you undertake when you're rolling out your survey? You know, how do you align it with other ways of tracking in your organisations or encourage it with your volunteers?
So I guess one of the things that's been really helpful with our volunteer advisory committee is after I've drafted a survey, I will share it with them, and they can ask them for feedback on it. So I think getting their input is really helpful. And the most recent survey we did, we actually had a couple of questions that were specifically written by the VAC. For example, there was a question on how do you want, Volunteer Advisory Committee, VAC, how do you want the VAC to engage with you? And then also having them encourage other volunteers to complete the survey. In regards to encouraging people to complete the survey, I think having different formats to promote the survey. So, you know, in newsletter, in person, Facebook groups, lots of things like that, and an email reminder as well. People are so busy these days that it's helpful to have a few reminders. Another thing to consider is letting people know if it's going to be anonymous. Let people know that up front. And you know, they're more likely to fill it in if they feel that that it's anonymous. And in regards to the other thing that we did was with our VAC is, so we've got a roadmap that the VAC developed, and one of the goals is to enhance volunteer engagement. And another one is around enhancing volunteer commitment, reliability and retention. So they're all kind of integrated and working together. So our volunteer advisory committee has been very involved in kind of working with me to increase that engagement. And in regards to feedback to the organisations, so developing a report from the survey results is really important, and with a survey report, looking at not just kind of really analysing the data, what is the data telling you? And one of the really important things that I have found is actually filtering the data. So looking at different roles, do volunteers in different roles have different experiences? Is the satisfaction level different across the roles? Is the tenure different across the roles? And what is the data telling us reasons why that might be the case? And in the report as well, putting forward recommendations, which is from what the data is telling you. So, and then presenting those findings or the survey report to not only the volunteers and the leadership team, but all employees and our board as well. And then that can help making those recommendations become a reality if they're ones which are more at an organisational level rather than changes that I can just implement myself.
Fantastic, Christine. That's really, I think, quite helpful and breaks it down for how you can make it most actionable, because obviously we all know the worst thing would be is if we're going out to volunteers and really trying to seek their opinion and then nothing happens with their input. Marg, I'll throw to you. What other considerations are there? And, you know, bearing in mind that you're both in decently large organisations with probably multiple factors feeding into every time you look at volunteer engagement.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we've got everything from, you know, our directions that come down from DELP to, you know, our organisational direction, and then property plans and strategic plans right down into our own areas. So it is part of aligning with all of those other processes and making sure that you are, you know, putting your volunteer program, I guess, at the forefront sometimes, and being able to say, well, yes, we've got this measure in paid workforce, but we've also got this measure. Can I just say, it's sometimes very, very satisfying to be able to pull out figures and say, oh, you know, that's our staff satisfaction rate, is it? Well, our volunteer satisfaction rate is, you know, how many of a percentage points higher? But we send it out to our volunteers through email and use SurveyMonkey, which I know, again, that's a bit of a polarizing program, but if you are just starting out, it's got some really good tools in there. So I just sort of continue to use it because we were using that in the early days, and so that makes us able to compare, you know, surveys over a period of time. One of the things is the anonymity of it. I would strongly recommend that, and Christine touched on it. You will get a higher response rate if people are comfortable and confident that it's anonymous. And we do stress that. Having said that, in the little preamble at the start of the survey, I encourage anybody who has issues that need addressing, because the survey is anonymous, they can send it to a particular email. And that email is just an alias for my email. It only comes to me, but it's not my my zoo, my name. And I think, again, that it's just a generic name that I've given that particular email address, but it does come to me and only to me. And I think, again, that gives people who've got particular issues that they want addressed an avenue for that. But it is anonymous. Once we've done it, we report back, and I think that's key to encouraging completion. It sounds a little bit cart before horse, because how are they going to complete it if you're already feeding back? But what we've found is giving that feedback on what the findings have been encourages completion for the next year. So, and also, I mean, nobody wants to just be filling out things for the sake of filling them out. Everybody wants to know what the findings that they've contributed to are. So we report back to the coordinators at each site, we report back to their management, to the organisation more broadly, but we also report back to the volunteers themselves, which is really important.
Fantastic. And yeah, so critical to make sure volunteers are kept in that feedback loop, because you can be so busy implementing recommendations, saying to the organisation, we need to do this, that, and the next thing, but making sure they know what you're doing as a result of their feedback is so important. I will move on, but I'll flag that if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat. We are getting closer to the end of our formal questions, so please don't be shy. If you want to pick both Marg and Christine's brains, please submit any questions you might have via that chat function. So I guess, how do you actually use the data? And, you know, you both touched a little on how you, you know, what you do as a result of the volunteer engagement survey in terms of providing recommendations to the organisation. But I guess, to go back to you, Marg, how do you track those annual reports, annual results, and, you know, what do you in general do as a result of the survey?
Look, at the moment, for me, I'll admit it's probably a little bit clunky because what I've been doing is just putting into Excel. We've been doing this now for about 8 years. So it's really only now that we're getting some really robust data, as in over a period of time, out of it. So it's about, you know, popping it into Excel and seeing what trends there are there. So that's really how, you know, I go about tracking those annual results. And then, as I say, we've got other ways of tracking just general feedback. Actioning is interesting. And I think in terms of establishing boundaries, that's been twofold. In firstly, the preamble and the emails that are sent out with the questionnaire in the first place, because we did used to get a lot of sort of broad comments, if you like, about things that were completely outside of the volunteer program. You know, why don't we have fennec foxes at Melbourne Zoo? I don't get to have a say in the makeup of our animals that are there, and none of that is sort of helpful or insightful. So making sure that you've got clear instructions at the start about what it's really about, and the fact that it's about your volunteering experience rather than just an opportunity to come up with random ideas. So that's really important. But I also find that, again, that's something that when we do feedback to the volunteers and meet up with them at the various properties to give the feedback on the survey, that's a really good time for us to, again, speak about what we can action from them. And a really good example out of this year's one, and something that you just kind of go, oh, wow, what, you know, that's so easy to do. There were about, I guess, a dozen people who said, I'm just so bewildered by the use of acronyms, and everything seems to have acronyms, and is there anywhere we can have a go-to that tells us what all of these things mean? And so now I'm in the process of putting together a document that will help people understand what the various acronyms are across the various sites.
Fantastic, Marg. That's really, really helpful. Christine, how do you go about tracking annual results and what comes out? And, you know, really important that point you raised about boundaries, Marg.
So with boundaries, similar to Marg, in the opening kind of intro, make it really clear what the purpose of the survey is. Just, you know, dot points. And also providing, I guess, being really clear in the questions as well. So I found with time I've improved the way I do surveys, and that's certainly helped so that people understand why we're asking these things, and the fact that we will be reporting back to them as well around the survey results. What we do with the survey, so yeah, from the recommendations, many of the recommendations we find quick wins or things that we can implement ourselves. So for example, our foster carers, you know, they're now wanting, what came out of the survey was more about like the medical history of the animal each time they take a foster animal on board, because they know then you know, how to provide the best care for them if they know a bit more about their history. So that was quick and easy for us to be able to talk to our adoption centre and implement that. For bigger changes, feeding it up to our leadership team and seeking approval, whether it's for resourcing or whatever it is. And tracking annual results, I too will admit that, it is a little bit clunky, and I think last year's survey was probably I changed it quite a bit, and it's probably the best it's been. And now we're in a position to really start being able to compare to previous years. I feel really that we're in a good place now, whereas some of the questions before, as I said, learnt over time the best way to form the survey. So, and tracking results, I think, you know, obviously you can see from past surveys looking at the improvements that we've made, and then also being able to, at the end of each year, do a bit of a consolidation around the improvements that were made, not only through the surveys, but through all other engagement activities with our volunteers, and being able to feed back to the volunteers as well around, you know, we heard you, and this is what we're going to implement because of your feedback.
Fantastic, Christine. Now, before we go to our last kind of planned question, we might attack some of the questions that have come through from the chat, because there are some great ones. And I'll start off with what I hope is an easy one, which is just someone asking about the platforms you both use. Marg, I think you mentioned you use SurveyMonkey.
Yeah, that's right. Use SurveyMonkey, and then it gets emailed out through Better Impact. But I mean, that's just the portal for the email.
How about you, Christine?
We also use SurveyMonkey. I find it really easy to use, and then we've got the templates ready to go for the next year. And you know, you build the survey questions in, and you can do all the filtering. Very easy to use. So highly recommend it.
Absolutely. It's one of the most intuitive pieces of software I've taught myself to use over the last number of years. We've got another question through the chat, which is, again, what are just the most useful questions you ask in the surveys, in your surveys generally?
I'd have to say for me, the most useful are those 10 you know, sort of sliding scale. How much do you agree with this? 10 questions about how you feel about volunteering, your volunteering role. So, you know, are you proud? Are you happy? Are you feeling supported? Are you involved? Those sorts of things.
Fantastic. How about you, Christine?
I will answer that, but I just thought of something else that might be helpful is when I'm writing the survey as well, I kind of break it down into groups of questions. So for example, at the start, I'll have demographics. So which volunteer role do you volunteer in, etc. How long have you been a volunteer, things like that. But then it's broken down to, for example, communication. And I might have a couple of questions around communication. For example, overall, how would you rate our communication with volunteers over the COVID-19 period? How satisfied are you with our volunteer newsletter? And then, you know, I'll have a section around induction and training, and questions like, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And it might be, I feel confident about my role and my responsibilities, and then a rating of strongly disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. But sorry, to get back to your question, I think probably something that's really telling and that management really listen to is how likely is it that you would recommend volunteering with Lord-Smith to a friend or colleague. So having a Net Promoter Score, and that is again, really helpful to look at that and filter across the roles and see if there's any big differences across the roles. And just, yeah, I found that that was a question that really impressed our leadership team and resonated with them, to show them how that it is a really positive experience to volunteer with our organisation. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so another question that's come through is, do you often need to conduct further investigations as a result of survey feedback? And if so, how do you go about it? So Mark, have you ever had to do that?
It's difficult to answer that one directly because I guess the anonymity that is there. So it again, if I encourage people to reach out to me directly if there's something they want to discuss. There's certainly probably over the journey been themes in certain areas, and whilst we don't know who those particular volunteers are as individuals, if there is an emerging theme that in perhaps one area of the business they're just not feeling included, or they're feeling that they're not being valued, then I'll take that up with the managers in that area.
Fantastic. How about you, Christine?
Yeah, similar to Mark. So if a particular role or area, again, and looking at themes, as Mark said, is really valuable. Themes come up and that helps also build the recommendations as well. And when it has become apparent that a particular area is perhaps not feeling as supported than the other roles, then talking with our volunteer advisory committee with people who are in that role and trying to get a bit more feedback and understanding is really helpful. But yeah, as Mark said, with the anonymity, and I can never say that word, it does make it difficult, but with the themes, it's very clear that if there is a particular issue, it shows up, and then you can talk to other volunteers in that role. It hasn't happened where I've done a workshop with that particular group of volunteers, but that's certainly something that I would look at doing if it stood out. So perhaps getting that group of volunteers together and doing a bit of a workshop around what's working well and what areas to improve on, and how can we improve your volunteer experience.
Thanks, Christine. Fantastic. And sorry, my mouse went a little haywire just then. Just a couple more questions that are coming through. One is around someone who said they inherited a great email list but don't get a great response via email. So thinking of sending out a physical questionnaire. How often would you contact a volunteer with no response before you let them go? Mark, did you want to touch base on this one first?
Yeah, this is probably a broader question about volunteer engagement rather than just the surveys, because I'm guessing that this person's talking about people that are just not responding to anything. We have a process, so we have a policy around, and I've even got little flow charts of how to follow if you're not hearing back from a volunteer. I guess the thing is that we never want to take for granted the fact that they've just dropped off because they're not interested. As we've found out over COVID, lives are many and complex, and there's all sorts of reasons why people, cease to engage. And so we have a procedure to follow. We've got pro forma emails, again, because we've got an automated system. We've got a volunteer management system. We can put templates into that system that in the first instance are pretty, kind of gentle and broad, and it's like, hey, Sarah, I haven't heard from you. Hope everything's well, blah, blah, blah. Then there's another one that goes out. We then will send out physical letters, make phone calls, all of these attempts being recorded in the volunteer's profile, so we know where we're at with it. And then there's a final email that goes out and says, hi, we've tried to contact you on this date, and this date, or whatever, by whatever means. We still haven't heard back from you. I hope everything's okay. But if you don't respond by, and we'll give it a fortnight or something like that, that you'll be removed from the list.
Fantastic. Did you have an approach you wanted to share to that, Christine?
We have a very similar approach to Marg. So with surveys, we don't chase up or, know who's completed them because they're anonymous. But in regards to general engagement, we have the same, very similar process to go through, and we'll make calls and emails, etc. And our final email will say, it appears that this may not be the right time for you to volunteer, and please get in touch with us again if you're in a position to volunteer. But if we don't hear from you by such and such a date, we will make you inactive and that kind of thing. So same situation, because you don't want people, there's no point having 800 people who are on the books when only 300 of them are actually volunteering with you. And I guess that having that process of being able to, I don't want to say audit because that sounds negative, but having a really current, up-to-date database with who is actively volunteering is really important.
Absolutely, and a big job in and of its own right. There's one more question before we do a little wrap up and final questions, unless anyone else wants to sneak one more into the chat, which absolutely do, because these two have a wealth of knowledge to share. We did have a participant who was interested in learning a bit more about volunteer advisory committees. And so, Christine, I know that you've done quite a bit of work on yours at Lord Smith. They were just hoping to learn whether that's made up of staff or volunteers or both, and how it's been set up and works. So if you want to talk about that shortly, that might be a subject for another webinar.
Sure, I'll give it a little bit of a rundown. So yeah, we started in 2016. I had no idea what I was doing, so made it up as I went, and I've learned a lot along the way. It is made up of myself and volunteers, up to 12 volunteers across different roles. So we try as much as possible to have a representation of all volunteer roles and diversity across the volunteer cohort. So I think one of my big learnings is around the governance of it and having a really clear terms of reference. So I had one to begin with, and then each year I've improved on it and making it really clear around what the purpose of the VAC is. And it's gone from strength to strength. Last year they developed a volunteer charter, a VAC charter, I should say, and a roadmap, which is all sorts of engagement activities and supporting the continuous improvement of the volunteer program as well. So they do everything from providing feedback on, as I said, like the volunteer survey or volunteer strategy, different things, being involved in workshops for the volunteer strategy. It can be doing things like they've just recently set up coffee catch-ups. So once every 2 months, they will organise a bit of a peer get-together for any volunteer can come along to it, just to meet other volunteers and meet people in different roles. yeah, they provide advice on processes and things. So in the roles that they are undertaking, if they have noticed an area that could be improved on, they will let us know. So in the first year, we made a huge amount of improvements. And like one little example is, for example, one of our kennels volunteers pointed out that, you know, every time we take the dogs out, we're spending all this time fiddling around with halters and measuring them up for the different dogs. Why don't we have instead hooks and for each of the enclosures? So enclosure 1, we have for that particular dog who's in enclosure 1, their halter is pre-measured, ready to go, and on a hook, and it's marked 1 for enclosure 1. And the same for all the enclosures. So when volunteers come in for their new shift, they don't have to muck around with measuring, it's measured for that dog already. So they've helped out with a lot of continuous improvement activities and engagement activities. Yeah, and what else can I tell you about that? I think one of the things that I learned as well was having a term on it. So I now have, we have, a 12-month term. So, and potentially that could be 2 years, but I guess a term so that we can encourage new volunteers to become involved in it every year, every 12 months, new voices, and it also provides an opportunity for leadership within our volunteers as well. And yeah, sorry, that's probably in a nutshell.
Fantastic. That's great. And yeah, it is sometimes a lot of these things, as Christine pointed out, it's about trialing something, you know, getting expert advice and then improving on it on a year in, year out basis. So the final question I had for both Marg and Christine, and I think you guys have probably answered it in some way, shape or form, but I'll ask it anyway. What advice would you give to organisations looking to start out a volunteer engagement survey or improve their existing volunteer engagement survey? And Marg, I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Sarah. I think probably a little bit of what I covered before, but definitely get help. I think sometimes as leaders of volunteers, we take the road that whatever is being asked of us, we have to do, and without any assistance. And it can be quite a complex area, and you won't get the answers to the questions you seek necessarily if they're not designed correctly. So the first thing I'd say is get help, and there's plenty of help out there. The second is thinking about the logic of your survey. So if anybody's familiar with SurveyMonkey, it has logic built into it, which means that you're not asking irrelevant questions of groups that you might want information from. So for example, our survey, similar to what Christine was saying around perhaps years you've been volunteering at the start, will take you a slightly different path for a few questions than if you've been volunteering for a long time, because one of the things what we want to know from our new volunteers is, has their volunteering experience thus far matched their motivations for volunteering? So you don't want to be asking those sort of things year after year of your established volunteers. They're just going to go, oh, this is boring garbage and I've done it before. But having your logic correct can give you some really good insights into other areas. And I suppose the final thing about surveys I'd say is just don't ask questions for questions' sake. Don't have this go on, you know, that it's really going to require somebody to sit down, take half an hour out of their day, you know, type great long paragraphs as responses. Christine's picked up on it before. Short, sharp, clear. You're still going to get the answers you seek. You'll still get plenty of data, but it doesn't have to be, you know, the reworking of War and Peace.
Amen to that, Mark. Christine, did you have any advice to give to organisations or individuals starting out?
I guess just, you know, don't be afraid to ask for feedback from, you know, a trusted volunteer or a peer. Get someone to test it as well before you send it out. That's always helpful. And I think also just think of it as having that continuous improvement mindset, that even if you just try it and then learn from it, and continuously every year, what could I do better this year? And, is there a way that I can improve that? Or, it's, I guess the biggest thing is just to do it and give it a go, and it's well worth it. And I think I was just going to say also, one of the things that I've found as well is volunteers are so appreciative, of being given, whether it's through a survey or other engagement, consultation, whatever it is. It's such a demonstration of we value you and we value your input. We're listening to you. And it's just a demonstration of recognition of the value of volunteers.
Fantastic. Thank you. And look, I hope you both have had a look at the chat. There's some incredible feedback for you sharing your wisdom and understanding things that you've gained from the sector already. So thank you both for sharing your expertise today. And on behalf of Volunteering Victoria, thank you. And we've reached the end of the webinar. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day out in the sun. Thanks,
Sarah. Happy International Volunteer Managers Day.
Yes. Thank you for slotting that in, Mark. Go do something nice for yourselves as volunteer managers for International Volunteer Managers Day. Fantastic. Bye, guys.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.